This presentation covers early Christian art and architecture after the fall of the Roman Empire and at the end of the Roman Empire and the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity in Rome and the Roman areas of Roman occupation. One thing that does happen during this period is we see the implosion of the Roman Empire. We see the loss of that stabilizing political model and also the military presence of the Roman legions throughout Europe and the surrounding areas of the Mediterranean and Northern Africa. With that collapse comes, again, incredible instability where you have the Danes, eventually, Vikings coming in, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, other entities that come in from different areas and try to exert their power, try to influence, sometimes just sacking towns and cities for wealth, for gain. It can be a really, really brutal time that we're looking at as we go forward in time after, again, the fall of the Roman Empire. You do have other entities that start up at this time. You have the Byzantine Empire that is established on the heels of the Roman Empire, and that's in the east. That's in Constantinople. It's built upon Emperor Constantine and what he starts to create there. And eventually we'll see the rise of Islam once that religion is established with Muhammad. So that's going to be an important factor as well. Later, we'll talk about, not in this presentation, but coming up, we'll talk about Charlemagne and his influence, the Carolingian period, the Romanesque period, and other changes that will happen. All right. Now, again, why is Europe unstable? And I've just talked a little bit about that. It's because the really vast system of governance that the Roman Empire, the Roman civilization provided, that's gone in the West. Again, Emperor Constantine does create stability in the East, in Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul. And the Byzantine Empire does provide, a structure similar to the Roman Empire, but not as well organized. And it eventually collapses as well because it's not as well run. There's a lot of corruption that occurs at different times. And then again, there also, once Islam is established and the religion of Islam is the fastest growing religion in history. It spreads from the Indus River to Morocco in 100 years. It's really an amazing story. So that also will create more tension and challenges to the weakened Byzantine Empire. All right, so let me move on. And also, the Roman military was stronger than what the Byzantine Empire, what they were able to muster. Let's look at the art and architecture now. So early Christian art, it's also called Paleo-Christian or primitive Christian art. It was architecture, painting, and sculpture from the beginnings of Christianity until about the early 6th century, particularly the art of Italy and Western Mediterranean. And we find that the architecture, and I'll be talking about this more, but the architecture is really based on existing Roman civic and imperial forms. And one that worked really well for early Christian society and churches to function was the basilica form, because this rectangular form really matched up well with the needs of the Christians. It gave a large space for the congregation to congregate, the nave, and then it also provided an area in the front where a priest could go through the sacrament of well, conduct the mass, I should say, and then prepare the wine and bread for dispersing to the congregants. Yeah. Also, the basilica, with its rectangular form, kind of worked well with the east-west orientation that was desired for Christian churches. Early themes that we see in Christian art include Christ as the Good Shepherd, and then other symbolic imagery. A striking aspect of the Christian art of the 3rd century is really the absence of the imagery that will dominate Christian art in later centuries, which would be certainly images of Mary, images of the crucifixion and resurrection, and also Acts of the Apostles. The beginnings of an identifiable Christian art can be traced to the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century. Considering the Old Testament prohibitions against graven images, it's important to consider why Christian art developed in the first place. The uses of images will be a continuing issue in the history of Christianity. The best explanation for the emergence of Christian art in the early church is due to the important role images played in Greco-Roman culture. And we've seen that already in our survey, how important images were for propaganda, to communicate visually, especially to illiterate masses. And many early Christians were illiterate. You know, they weren't necessarily nobility or well-educated people. And so imagery and images and symbols would be very important in communicating ideas to this populace. As Christianity gained converts, the new Christians had been brought up on the value of images in their previous cultural experience, and they wanted to continue this in their Christian experience. For example, there was a change in burial practices in the Roman world away from cremation to inhumation, the practice of burying the dead. Outside the city walls of Rome, adjacent to major roads, catacombs were dug into the ground to bury the dead. Families would have chambers or cubicula dug to bury their members. Wealthy Romans would also have sarcophagi or marble tombs carved for their burial. The Christian converts wanted the same things. Christian catacombs were dug frequently adjacent to non-Christian ones, and sarcophagi with Christian imagery were apparently popular with the wealthier Christians. Tracing the early days of Christian artwork can be a difficult task to undertake, because before 100 CE, Christians were a persecuted minority. So the chances of them being allowed to even create art at that time was slim. And, you know, Christianity was really a small fringe religion with very few followers and little to no public recognition or support. So Christian painters would not have had the luxury of financial support from patrons. It was also forbidden to create idols. So this too would have influenced the lack of art before 100 CE. Historians and scholars have divided early Christian art into two distinct periods: before 313 CE, Common Era, and after 313 in the Common Era. 313 was the year of the Edict of Milan, again, which allowed Christianity to be practiced. It was no longer illegal. Now, this is interesting. The symbol of the cross was not used to represent Jesus until many centuries later. As in the early days of Christianity, crucifixion was a common form of punishment for various offenses, and therefore would not have been exclusively linked with Christianity, but rather with the brutality of the Roman Empire, with incivility. Besides the early Roman discrimination against Christianity and Christian art, several other possible factors could have resulted in a lack of art representing Christian figures. The people of that time were influenced by several different theologies and philosophies. Some believed that God could be experienced directly. Others thought that he couldn't. And others thought that if he could, then he should not be physically depicted. Historians also suggest that perhaps the main reason Christian art does not exist in the earliest days of the religion is that the majority of folk were poor and did not own any property. Once the economic situation improved for them, they were able to afford to support the creation of Christian paintings, sculptures, and architecture. Emperor Constantine defeated Maxentius in 312 in the Common Era, after which he became the main patron of Christianity, transforming the religious landscape and the associated buildings dramatically. After he granted religious tolerance to Romans in 313 in the Common Era, with the Edict of Milan, Rome changed towards an increasingly Christian territory. It was the responsibility of the reigning emperor to create places of worship for his subjects, and these temples reflected the provincial religious faith at the time of his reign. So we see a transition from pagan gods, pagan temples, to now having to provide for an increasing Christian populace. And the basilica form is one type of architectural form that really fit the needs of the Christians very well. And we saw this at the end of the last presentation when talking about Rome. We saw this as an image, and this is, again, a typical Roman basilica form with arches, use of stone, very simple, and it would have been a form that the Romans would use to have the orator up front, and again, it just translated really well and was a form that could be adopted by and repurposed by Christians if need be. Constantine constructed many different churches, and some very significant churches, including the Church of St. Peter's in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and others in and around Constantinople. Now, it was a challenge for the architects to figure out a new layout and form for religious worship, as the previous designs were created for a different function other than the Christian method of indoor communion. So they needed to be large to house the ever-growing Christian fellowship and to make a visible distinction between the faithless and the faithful. What was needed was both function and a new identifiably Christian visual symbol in architectural form. As I mentioned, basilicas were not new, and they'd been built for centuries by the Romans. Sometimes extensions to palaces, public meeting halls, courts of law. And these courts usually had a judge presiding from a chair situated at the end of the hall in a semicircular dome overlooking the hall. This imposing aesthetic carried over from court of law to the place of worship, to the priest standing at his altar. Okay, so now we move from Emperor Constantine, who we did cover somewhat in the last presentation, to Emperor Justinian I. And he served as emperor of the Byzantine Empire from 527 to 565. He's best remembered for his work as a legislator and codifier. During his reign, Justinian reorganized the government of the Byzantine Empire and enacted several reforms to increase accountability and reduce corruption. He was also known for his military conquests, expansion of the empire, and patronage of architecture and the arts. All right, let's take a look. All right, so previously we talked about the boot of Italy. We've talked about Rome. We talked about the Etruscans here, but we really didn't talk about some other areas, some other city-states, but some of these now will become important in our timeline right now of the rising of the Byzantine Empire. And that'll be Venice, Milan, the Edict of Milan, and then over, as we move towards Greece and over to Turkey, we're looking at this land bridge here, which is very important, and obviously a strategic area that Emperor Constantine carefully chose to move his whole entourage from Rome, where it was more unstable, to the east, to a place where he felt like he had a lot of support. And he, and he renamed, of course, the city Constantinople. It later becomes renamed Istanbul. So this is part of the growing Byzantine Empire. This is a stable region here. Over here, Rome will eventually fall, and this becomes a little more unstable. And it's really up to the individual city-states to provide security for its people. So we're going to look at that dynamic. We'll also see that the Byzantine Empire will extend into Syria and other areas and have influence, even in this region of the Middle East. We talked a little bit about catacombs, the need to bury the dead as a Christian ritual. And again, in ancient Rome, it was not permitted for bodies to be buried within the city walls. So pagans cremated the dead, but Christians had to turn to a different way of burying. And what they did was use the catacombs as a way of getting around that. These are some paintings from some of the catacombs. You can see some of the skulls over here. And, if we look at the paintings, yeah, they're pretty primitive. Are they similar to what we see in Pompeii and some of the other regions of the Roman Empire? Yeah, to some extent. But certainly not to the same level of quality. The imagery is that of, in this case, it's Jesus with the lamb, so he's the good shepherd. So you're going to see different images representing the Christian faith. We also see that sarcophagi are used similar to what the Romans would have used. In ancient Rome, they would have carried inscriptions, related to their mythology. And in the case of Christians, obviously, the images would relate to Christianity. So here we can see, once again, Jesus as the good shepherd. and other imagery that relates to Christianity. And this particular one is carved out of marble, just as the Romans uh, sarcophagi would have been carved as well. Notice also, this is in 270 in the Common Era, and just as we saw in the images of emperors, like the, tetrarchy of the kind of almost child-sized proportions of the figures, we see the same thing here. It's more of the storytelling that's important, but we do see a fall off in the quality of art. This is kind of nice from 256 in the Common Era. This is a reproduction of what would have been the baptistry at a Christian meeting house in Syria. And we can see how this, this reconstruction kind of shows what a meeting house may have looked like. And this is before Christianity is legalized. So what Christians did was privately meet in homes, and some of them would have been decorated or would have had images of, again, Christ as a good shepherd or other images that represent the Christian faith. All right. It's good now to take a look at some of the terms that we need to know as we move forward through the upcoming art periods in Europe. Some of the terms relate to specific parts of churches and basilicas and cathedrals. And we'll see a couple of those structures being used in the architecture at this period, and then we'll see the evolution as time goes on. So this is more of a type of cathedral form that we'll see later in our survey, but some of the structures are the same as what we see in these early Christian basilica forms. So the narthex here is a gathering space. So, many churches, what they'll have is they'll have a wall and doors here. They'll have two sets of doors, one from the outside of the church where you enter, and then you enter the narthex space, which is a gathering space. So for instance, if you go to a Christian wedding in a formal church or cathedral, a lot of times the people will be ushered into the nave and sit down, and the priest is up front, and then the groom will also be up front waiting for the bride. The bride comes in last, and she'll often come in with her bridesmaids in the narthex and wait in that area, and then the doors open, and then she is escorted down, usually by her father, to the front of the church, and then the ceremony begins. Other structures that we see are the aisles on either side, and then instead of calling it an aisle, around the apse, which is the place where the religious ceremonies take place, where the priest is, and where the host, what is considered the body of Christ, is present, and the wine as well, is all there in the altar area, the apse. The area around the apse, it's sort of like an aisle, but it's called the ambulatory. It allows for people to, especially those who are visiting a cathedral, you have sometimes visitors coming in during a mass, and in order to move the people through, they would go through the ambulatory and then exit down the aisle. And here I'm talking a little bit about these different spaces. And one other thing are the clerestory windows, which are very high windows versus the gallery windows, which would be a little lower, and they allow light into the space. Eventually, as we see these church forms evolve over the centuries, we're going to see very elaborate windows that are even included color glass, stained glass, but not at this point. One of the important churches that we're going to look at is St. Peter's Basilica. It's an important building when it comes to the history of Rome. It was the first church built after the death of St. Peter to memorialize his martyrdom. And the church itself of St. Peter's flourished for about 1,200 years, bringing in regular worshipers and pilgrims from the rest of the world. So the groundbreaking happened between 326 and 333, and it was demolished in 1609. It was built, let's see, it was the building that stood from the 4th to the 16th century, as I mentioned, where the new St. Peter's Basilica stands today in Vatican City. It was built over the historical site of Circus of Nero, and it began during the reign of Emperor Constantine I. So here we can see the plan. Again, remember, a plan is looking from above down. And this is the plan of St. Peter's, the original old St. Peter's. And there is a sort of courtyard. So you would enter, that's called an atrium. It too is a large outdoor space. And then you enter the narthex, the gathering space, and then into the church itself with the nave and then the side aisles. And then these are columns that help support the structure. And the transept, in this case, the arms of the structure, and then the apse in the front where the altar is. And then on the side, you may have, a lot of churches will have baptistries that are circular forms like this. And then this is what it would look like. This is called an elevation. We're not looking from above directly down, we're looking from an aerial view, and we're able to see the structure, the walls, the roof, and so forth. So these would be the clear story windows. These would be the gallery windows down below. And then this is a beautiful drawing of St. Peter's, the old St. Peter's. And we can see that, yes, there's some columns here, also some columns with this wall, but it's rather tall, but it's not really structurally sound as some of the other buildings that the Romans would have built during the Roman Empire. So what happened to it? By the 15th century, the church was really falling into ruin. And so the Pope who went to France for a time, to Avignon, and came back to Rome, there was discussions with some of the leading creative architects of the period, including Alberti, one of the great Renaissance architects and sculptors. And so there were discussions, and Alberti is quoted as saying, "I have noticed in the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome a crass feature." So crass means, it's kind of ugly, or it's very crude. And he says, "An extremely long and high wall has been constructed over a continuous series of openings with no curves to give it strength and no buttresses to lend it support." So buttresses are something that they were using during that time, during the Renaissance, and even before that in the Gothic period. So he's not seeing any of that in this old structure. "The whole stretch of wall has been pierced by too many openings and built too high." Every time you put a window, you're weakening the wall. "As a result, the continual force of the wind has already displaced the wall more than 6 feet from the vertical. I have no doubt that eventually some slight movement will make it collapse." So his assessment is it's not sound. So it's probably not worth saving. And the Pope listened to him, and so they tore the church down. So he did have Pope Julius II did have intentions of keeping it, restoring it, but in the end, again, he thought otherwise. So, what are some of the other building types in the early Christian community in the during the time period that we're looking at right now, the Byzantine time? Um, the buildings that Christians would use would be buildings that the Romans were building, and the early Christians would be familiar with these building forms. They would know how to build them. They would have examples that they could look at, and these are the ones that they adopted initially. Of course, we talked about the basilica form and why that was used, but there are others too. Bathhouses, Roman bathhouses were circular, and there were a lot of those all across the Roman Empire. And also Roman mausoleums were a circular form. So these forms as well were adopted by the early Christians for both their mausoleums and for some of their churches. Now, the circular form doesn't function as well as the basilica form, so we don't see as many of those constructed. And then we don't see that going forward into later art periods in Europe. We see the rectilinear form of the basilica being the one that really is the most functional and the one that is built the majority of the time. All right, Santa Costanza in 350, and it's built by Constantine as a mausoleum for his daughter Costanza, and it was later consecrated in 1256 as a church. So initially mausoleum, later a church, and it's really a really great example of early Christian architecture. Circular form, similar to the Roman mausoleums. Also, we call that circular area, we have another term for it. We call it a rotunda. Oftentimes, there's a dome associated with the rotunda, and it's just a really beautiful space. There's also a vestibule porch that leads into a circular barrel vaulted ambulatory, which surrounds a central domed space. So remember, the ambulatory is like an aisle around the altar for people to move. We also see beautifully decorated mosaics with geometric motifs, intertwined vines on a white background, and late imperial motifs with Christian symbolic significance. There are also 12 pairs of coupled Corinthian columns with arches between them, and they support the dome lit by 12-story windows. So here is the plan. Again, remember, we're looking straight down. It's a plan. And you have the gathering space, the narthex, and then you'll enter a circular rotunda with the ambulatory on the outside, and then columns, paired columns, and the altar in the center. These structures that the early Christians are building, these architectural structures, oftentimes will repurpose existing Roman materials. So we have to remember, Rome was sacked at the end of the Roman Empire, and buildings were often destroyed, they're burnt, but they're still likely reusable elements, columns that are made of marble or granite, Corinthian capitals, things that could be repurposed. And that's what happens a lot of the time in this period, going all the way into the medieval period, are repurposed architectural items, forms, as well as there are bronzes of things like that that were pagan, and pagan forms would be a threat to Christianity, to this growing Christian movement. So those forms would have been locked away, or the bronze would have been melted down and repurposed in some way. And we can see it here. A lot of these columns and other forms within the buildings will be repurposed from Roman buildings. It is a beautiful space if you look at it. It's very open. It's monumental in size, as you can see by the size of the chairs here. The clear story windows bring in a lot of light. It's a really beautiful space, and the Corinthian capitals really add a grandeur to the space as well. Church of the Holy Sepulchre is very, very significant because it was a place of Jesus's tomb. It was one of the most important churches to Christendom. And unfortunately, the Mad Caliph in the Fatimid Empire, just like we have, even looking back in our survey, we had Akhenaten, who was the first religious persecutor, who started to condemn and really put down very forcefully anyone who didn't worship the Aten. We have that through time, and certainly we see it with ISIS today, where they've destroyed some religious landmarks just out of ignorance. It's really sad to see, and it goes with every religion, whether we're talking Muslim, Christian, Jewish. You have fringe people who are radical and who will hurt others because they don't believe the same thing that they believe. And that's what happens at this time, where religious tolerance wasn't accepted by the Mad Caliph, with the ultimate aim of converting the empire's Jews and Christians to Islam. He ordered the destruction of non-Muslim buildings and objects throughout the empire, and specifically in the city of Jerusalem, including synagogues, Torah scrolls, Jewish artifacts, and especially the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, also known as the Church of Jesus' Resurrection. So all we have from the original is this reconstruction of what it looked like. All right, Galla Placidia. She was a daughter of the Roman Empire, Theodosius I. She was a mother, tutor, advisor to the Emperor Valentinian III, and a major force in Roman politics for most of her life. And she had other functions as well as a queen consort, and she was very active in politics and government until her death. So this is what she looked like. She was also a regent, a very high position, and engaged in numerous grandiose building projects in Rome, Jerusalem, and Ravenna. And she's most famous for her mausoleum, which has the oldest surviving mosaics in Ravenna, Italy. So here is the mausoleum, and it was built 425 to 450. This is what it looks like, surviving all those years. And inside, we see what we'll continue to see through the Byzantine Empire in interior building spaces in churches and mausoleums. It's the use of mosaics, beautiful blue glazed tile that is applied to the walls. And we also will start to see the use of gold and other materials. This is a very famous mosaic of the Good Shepherd. Again, sort of the symbols of early Christendom. What we don't see is necessarily natural depictions of space and form, or very sophisticated depictions of space as well. It's all pretty simple, rather primitive type of work that we see throughout this period. We're a far distance from Athens and the great work of the Hellenistic Empire. With the fall of Rome, with the changes in politics, with the instability of the time, we see a real fall off in artistic quality. I mean, it's still beautiful, and we can appreciate it, we can study it, we can look at it for what it is for the context of that time period. But there really is a big difference. And this is the baptistry in Ravenna. We try to, understand the style of these buildings. It's a real mishmash of different styles coming into play here, because they're playing on older Roman forms, and they're trying to present the buildings, the architectural structures, with a new language that will represent Christian theology. So the storytelling is different. And why are they using these images? It's because, again, they grew up with seeing these images in the Greco-Roman tradition. This is the dome, looking up at the dome. Santa Maria Maggiore, and it is located in Rome, and it was founded in 432. And it upheld the belief that Mary truly was the mother of God. It was the first great church of Mary in Rome. And it really is magnificent, use of gold. So here we have something now. Now it's in Rome, so it's not, in one of the smaller city-states like Ravenna. So in Rome, just like in New York City in America, or Tokyo, or some of the other, or Shanghai in China, in these different areas, you're going to find more grandiose building, more elegance, more wealth that's able to go into the building program. And that's certainly exemplified here in this wonderful structure. These are some different aspects of the church, and some of the mosaics. And you see the use of gold gilding, precious gold leaf that is hammered out to be very thin and then applied. So it's real gold that's used. Okay, here's another one of the structures. It's probably produced in Rome. It's actually not a structure, it's a manuscript that was produced in the 420s or 430s. It's the oldest surviving illustrated biblical manuscript, and it's been in the Berlin State Library since 1875 to 1876. And so the earliest surviving manuscript of biblical context. You see, it's not in a great state, but this is what remains. It's tempera paint, which is a water-based opaque paint painted on vellum. So vellum is, at this point in 425, vellum is a type of paper that is made out of animal skins. And so it's very, very, very thin, and it's very expensive to create vellum, but that's what they're using. Now here's one that's kind of interesting from the early 5th century, and it is the Vatican Virgil. It's a rare treasure of the late antique world, and it's produced in Rome. It's produced around 400 in the Common Era, and it records the works of the poet Virgil. Now, there were originally about 440 leaves, individual leaves within this manuscript with 280 illustrations, but all that survived were 76 leaves. and about 50 illustrations. So this is what it looks like, again, on vellum. And again, it's that water-based tempera paint. So this is about, the best quality that we're seeing from this time period. It's not, it's not some of the best that we're going to see in our survey, but this is what's being produced during this time. And then we can also look at other sarcophagi. This is a pretty well-off government administrator who died in 359, and it's believed that he probably converted to Christianity right before his death. So his sarcophagus has many different biblical scenes, including Old Testament, Adam and Eve, and other scenes as well. Daniel in the lion's den, some others. Once again, we see this style of sculpture where the storytelling is most important, but the proportions of the figures are that of like a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old because the head is so large. And we've seen this now for some time, again, similar to the Tetrarchs and other sculpture. In part, it is a fall off in quality. If we were to compare this with the frieze of the Parthenon, the quality of the Parthenon sculptures are much, much better. Basilica of San Vitale. It's most famous for its wealth of Byzantine mosaics. It boasts the largest and best preserved mosaics outside of Istanbul. It's very important when looking at Byzantine art. And it's the only major church from the period of Emperor Justinian I to survive virtually intact. And this is the plan of it. Again, a gathering space of narthex. It's sort of a central plan, more of a circular form, but it has a little variation with the apse coming off of this circular dome. Clear story windows, gallery windows. This is the elevation, looking at it, and then what it looks like from the outside. And in the inside, quite luxurious, a lot of marble. So we remember, buildings most often will use materials that are quarried close to the building site. So Italy has some great quarries, some of the best marble in the world. You would also have some over in Greece and other areas. So here we go. You can see the application of beautiful marble and the mosaic. So this is Justinian in the center and his attendants. The eyes sometimes are a little larger because in this case, they are considered in Christian theology to be the windows to the soul. And then here we have Empress Theodora and her attendants. Now they're really struggling. The artists are struggling with proper drawing or perspective because they don't understand it. So we have what we can consider multiple vanishing points and horizon lines or eye levels in this particular mosaic. For instance, we're looking down at this fountain, so that means our eye level is up above. But here, this is straight, the base is straight. Oh, that tells us our eye level is right here. So it's a little confusing as we try to navigate through this visual image, and that's why it seems a little more primitive. There still are parts of it that are just very elegant, especially this attendant over here. The way her hand is gesture, her features, her proportions are very beautiful. Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. The fact that the building still showcases features of both Christian and Islamic architecture makes this monument a unique architectural masterpiece. The Byzantine architecture of Hagia Sophia served as an inspiration for many other Ottoman mosques such as Istanbul's Blue Mosque. Byzantine Emperor Constantius commissioned the construction of the first Hagia Sophia in 360. At that time, the city was known as Constantinople, taking its name from his father's Constantine I. And the name itself means holy wisdom. And then I'll have you read this. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but you can read this. But at different parts, at different times, it was burned, it was destroyed, it had to be rebuilt. And it wasn't really until Justinian that it really took on the form that it has now. He had two architects work on the construction, and it only took 6 years to complete it. So it's really quite a feat. And then again, you can read more about this. So it was a church for about 1,000 years, and then it was a mosque for about 500 years until 1934. And then it was secularized and made into a museum. I sort of like that idea. They did some restoration work on it. Some of the Christian paintings on the walls were restored. So I think, when you look at it, you have to look at it through the lens of both a Christian church and also a Muslim mosque. And I think having it as a museum is really a good solution. But unfortunately, Erdogan sanctioned the conversion of the building back into a mosque. It's a lot of kind of fighting about whether it should be a mosque or again a church. I'd like to see it remain as a museum myself. The complex was first known as the Great Church due to its sprawling size, and it really is monumental in size and scope. And the second church, built in the 5th century, rebranded as Hagia Sophia. And then it became Hagia Sophia. Today, it's also known as Hagia Sophia Muzesi, or the Holy Hagia Sophia Grand Mosque. And this is the plan for it. Again, just massive in size and scope. Beautiful, beautiful structure. I like seeing its history. I like seeing the Christian and the Muslim history represented in this wonderful building, wonderful structure, including the minarets. I think it's really awesome. And looking inside, you can get a feel for just the size of monumental size, and how it was built was kind of revolutionary for the time. The engineering that went into this. Really something. Okay, looking at Justinian, obviously, since he was able to get that built in 6 years, he was a man of action. He and in this particular little larger than a foot tall um, uh, creation here is carved out of ivory. It shows him, with a lot of movement here. There's a lot of movement, and it's packed space, which also energizes the art form. So we call this a bas relief. It's a shallow relief carved in ivory. Now, what are we also seeing as we look at this Byzantine art, Byzantine architecture? The architecture, yeah, it can still be quite grand, as we see in Hagia Sophia. But as we look at other artifacts, sculpture, and so forth, for the most part, it's smaller. It's not as monumental, not as grand, certainly, as what we see in looking back at ancient Egypt or Greece or Rome. Why? Because again, it's not as stable a society. When you have something that is stable over a period of time, and the society or the civilization is able to gather wealth and develop its artists, its craftsmen, then great things can be accomplished. But when you're struggling for survival, when you really worry about, whether you're going to be here okay, if you're going to be okay today or tomorrow or next week or next month, you're not necessarily thinking about creating art. You're thinking about putting food on the table or helping your children or helping your family or your community. It's a different situation. And so that's what we're going to see not only now in the Byzantine era. I mean, there is stability in the Byzantine Empire, but not like, again, not like the Roman Empire. And then as we move forward into what is known as the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, that's a time when Christianity itself was threatened. And there's a new system that will be set up, the feudal system. And it too will be a very dark and brutal time. And we'll see again that a lot of the artwork is very small in size because the people had to be ready to move in a moment's notice. This is a two-panel, it's called a diptych, versus a triptych. Triptych would be a three-paneled work of art, often telling a story. This is the Archangel Michael, just one leaf of, again, two panels. This is made of ivory as well. It's about 18 inches tall. Beautiful, beautiful carving here. Very nicely done. So this is showing the skill of the artists of this period. The Vienna Genesis may have been a luxury item intended for display, or it may have provided a synopsis of exciting stories from Scripture to be read for edification or conversion by a wealthy Christian. So again, another early 6th century, and it's another publication, or not, I wouldn't say publication, it's another manuscript that is created by hand on in this case, a dyed vellum. So the vellum itself is dyed this sort of ochre color, and then the illustrations in opaque water-based paints called tempera is done. So this is a little nicer, a little more luxurious than what we've seen previously, and in better condition as well. Now we go back to the Middle East, the monastery of St. Catherine in the 6th century. And the Orthodox monastery of St. Catherine stands at the foot of Mount Oreb, where the Old Testament records Moses received the tablets of the law. And this mountain is revered by Muslims and also is sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. And you can read about this. The monastery has never been destroyed in all its history, which, knock on wood, we hope that continues. And it can be said to have preserved intact the distinctive quality of its Greek and Roman heritage. The earliest description refers to the monastery of the Holy Virgin, for the revelation of God at the burning bush was seen relating to the Virgin Mary and the Incarnation. And the monastery is also especially dedicated to the holy prophets of Moses and Elias, who both came to this mountain and who both spoke with Christ at the Transfiguration. And then this is some of the art from the monastery itself. This is a painting in caustic, so we remember. This is similar to those encaustic paintings from Egypt So wax is the medium, and then the pigments are mixed in with the wax. The wax is heated so that it flows, and then you're able to paint with it. So it's a very, very durable medium. So the painting has withstand time over the many centuries, over 1,000 years, and done quite well. You can see some of the vivid colors that still remain in the acoustic on a wooden panel from the monastery. Now we come to a kind of interesting controversy where Christians were fighting amongst themselves whether images of Jesus, Mary, God, apostles, saints, whether they should be created at all, or if that would create idol worshiping rather than really focusing on what God represents and what Jesus represented in theory. So, it's something that still lives with us today, but it really got to a point of great contention within, again, the Christian community during the Byzantine era. And the iconoclasts argued that God was invisible and infinite, therefore beyond human ability to depict in images. Since Jesus was both human and divine, the iconoclasts argued that artists could not depict him in images. And it really did create great divides among Orthodox Christians. So when I talk about Orthodox Christians, I'm talking about the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church, often referred to as the Greek Orthodox Catholic Church, versus the Roman Western Catholic Church. So there was a split when Constantine moved his entourage to Constantinople. There was a split in the Catholic Church. We see in Rome more tolerance for images depicting Jesus, Mary, or God. And we see that certainly reach the height during the Renaissance period of that type of imagery. And we'll cover that in what's known as the Counter-Reformation of the Catholic Church later in our survey. But here you have these icon paintings, these images that are created of, at this time during the Byzantine Empire, mainly Jesus. And then in the latter part of the Byzantine Empire, as we get towards the 1200s, 1300s, we see more images of Mary being represented, and Mary and child, Madonna and child, and that these are believed to have, these are sacred, considered sacred paintings, icons, stylized, following a formula that goes back centuries of how to depict, again, Jesus or Mary or the apostles or saints. And it's an important part of the Orthodox Church. These icon paintings sometimes are believed to have powers as well, supernatural powers, that they're sacred items. And again, you could understand both sides, the argument for both sides. And there are images that even talk about this controversy, the crucifixion and iconoclasts. And these are some of the other images that come from this time period. Now we've moved to 950. So we're getting near a real crucial time period, the millennium, the year 1000, which will be a landmark time in Christianity, but we're not quite there yet. So Christianity is still under threat, even in 950. In 900, we have another Paris Psalter, so another type of illuminated manuscript that's created. And we can see the evolution of painting through time. Some of the other ivory carvings. This one is pretty small. It's a triptych. Opens up so that you have 3 panels. This is with the doors, the panels open. It's only about 10 inches tall. Nicely carved, ivory. Beautifully, this is beautifully carved. There's a real feeling of a natural movement of Jesus at the center here. And this is titled Christ Crowns Romanos and Eudokia, the Romanos ivory. So when we're looking at these, again, we're within the end of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire at this point is part of the East. It's pushed up into areas of, certainly in Turkey. It's pushing up into areas of modern day Russia, Romania, areas like that. That's the Eastern Orthodox Church. It'll occupy parts of modern day Poland eventually. This is all that Eastern Orthodox Church expanding in its area versus the Western Roman Catholic Church, which will dominate Italy, Spain, France, England, those areas. Okay, so again, we're in Greece. We're looking at another monastery, which is now considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site because it's gold, sumptuous interior of gold ground mosaics that are really spectacular. And this is very late in the Byzantine era. It's at the end of that time period, and we can take a look at what remains of it. A lot of it has deteriorated over time, but we can still see, the lavish use of gold in these mosaics, and the style now it's changed. So now we see Christ crucified and Mary represented. So it's very different from the earlier works that we saw with the early Christians. So we're talking 12th century. At this point, over in other parts of Europe, we're looking at the Gothic style starting to take place. A lot of changes there, but in the East, the Orthodox Church changes slowly, and its imagery is very different, very stylized, very abstracted in many ways. Now we do move back to Italy for St. Mark's in Venice, and the basilica was founded in the 9th century to house the corpse of St. Mark after wily Venetian merchants smuggled it out of Egypt in a barrel of pork fat. Possession of St. Mark's remains became the symbol of prestige for the city of Venice. And the basilica itself was built to house St. Mark's remains. And there it is. The city of Venice, the island city, and the interior of St. Mark's. Another cathedral in Montreal, Italy, is known worldwide for its mosaics, over 6,000 square meters and over 130 Byzantine mosaics adorn the church and depict episodes taken from the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the lives of the saints. So this is one that, I'm familiar of seeing, this icon painting, this major mosaic of Jesus at the top of the altar. It's really a spectacular work of art. And we're looking at the time period, 1180 to 1190. So we're in the Gothic period, and we're inching towards Renaissance, but we still have another 200 years to go. And what we see at this point is the exporting of Byzantine painting styles translated into mosaics in the church itself. Okay, now we're at late 13th century Byzantine painting. We don't know this particular artist by name, but this is a significant painting of the Madonna enthroned, with a circular throne in this case. And we see the position of her head, the tilt of her head, the halos, the representation of the child Jesus, and the highly stylized clothing that she's wearing. And this again is what we call like the Greek Orthodox icon painting style. It too will be exported to Italy and will help to usher in a new style of painting in Italy in the next 200 years after this. And we'll have artists, painters such as Duccio and others who will paint in this style, especially at the church of it'll come to me in a second. I'll come back. I'll circle back to that. All right. So this painting, the one that I just showed you, and the enthroned Madonna and Child are the oldest paintings. Oh, by the way, it was St. Francis, the Church of St. Francis in Assisi, that is really a lot of the painters who will bring that Byzantine painting style. They'll bring it to Italy and they'll work at that church, including Giotto, Duccio and Giotto. Anyway, the painting that I just showed you, this painting and the enthroned Madonna and Child, are the oldest paintings on the National Gallery of Art's walls. They may have been created by the same anonymous artist in Constantinople, then the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Panels such as these were highly influential in the development of Italian painting. As I mentioned, they stand at the very beginning of the history of panel painting in Italy. So this is true. And we'll see a little bit of this at the end of our survey, coming into play in the Gothic period. All right. Yeah, Byzantine icon painters also left Greece to work in Italy, bringing their techniques and styles with them. So that's the main thing that you want to take from that. It's very, very important in the development of and the history of painting itself. And again, it's an abstracted style of Byzantine icons. The gold striations that define folds in clothing, the round volume of Mary's veiled head, and the frontal pose of Jesus, who looks more like a miniature adult than a child, are all part of the Byzantine tradition, because their subject is not the temporary appearance of the physical world, but a holy and infinite presence. Icons avoid direct references to earthly reality and to specific times or places. Instead, their backgrounds are dematerialized with shimmering gold, and figures appear timeless and unchanging. All right, another church, Church of the Savior in Istanbul. And these are the most beautiful examples dating from the last period of Byzantine painting, the 14th century. The characteristic stylistic elements in those mosaics and frescoes are the depth, the movements and plastic values of figures, and the elongation of figures. And yeah, we can see a difference in these from some of the earlier images if we go back to the very early Christian church and the images that were presented there. We see a real development at this point, very dynamic, a lot of movement, and there will be one painter. Unfortunately, we probably won't see him in this survey because he comes after the survey, and he is known as the Greek. His name is El Greco, a great painter who will take this style and bring it to Italy and Spain and export this style to again bring it into his own work. Again, we've seen several different techniques. We want to note those. We want to remember those. Encaustic is using wax as a medium. We also saw the use of tempera paint, which is a water-based opaque paint. We saw mosaics, which are, fired ceramic pieces with a glaze that can be attached directly to the wall. And then we also, at the end, what we start to see is the use of fresco, which is a water-based paint that is applied to fresh plaster. So you have a window of opportunity. Once you apply the plaster and it starts to dry a little bit, you have a window of opportunity before it totally dries and sets to use a water-based paint that will be absorbed by the plaster and set within the plaster itself. So that too is a very permanent and durable type of way to paint onto walls. And that's it for this presentation. Thank you.